Hi guys! I thought I would do this podcast in order to bring together some of the facts that are emerging in the mainstream media about coronavirus, because you can glean some interesting things that are not being said from these facts. I also want to talk about Event 201. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it. It was a pandemic simulation that was conducted in late October last year by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and Johns Hopkins University or Institute. And I also want to talk about an article from Reuters about how this coronavirus is opening the lid on China's surveillance society, which is very important because these are some of the things that might be coming down the line. So one of the interesting facts that was reported by the China Academy of Medical Affairs, and also Caixin, that's Caixin, which is a reputable news outlet in Hong Kong, was that the nucleic acid test for coronavirus is only effective 30 to 50% of the time. So imagine a lot of people presenting, may not be diagnosed. Okay, at the moment, Dr. Ferguson at Imperial College was saying that China is only documenting serious cases. So when you see the figures, those are only serious cases that are not people experiencing like a mild flu or a cold. So for 2 straight days running over the weekend, we had a fall in the number of Hubei cases and Wuhan cases. And then last night there was again a rise, or should I say Monday, because they reported the figures for Monday at 6 o'clock Chinese time. They report the figures for Hubei and Wuhan. At 8 o'clock they report the figures for the rest of China. In Hubei, it was 2,680 new cases today, which was up from 2,147 the day before. In Wuhan, it was up to 1,921 from 1,379 the previous day. The highest ever new cases in Wuhan is 1,985, and that I think was Thursday or Friday, quite recently. So it's been speculated that due to the lack of test kits or inability to process the tests quickly, it's not really possible to get higher readings than maybe around 2,000. So on Sunday, after going up a third each day, those are the severe and critical cases in Wuhan and Hubei. So it was going up a third every day. But on Sunday, it was only up 1% in Hubei. So that's quite strange. So it's a very slow growth in the severe cases. So we'll wait to see. Those are the kind of figures coming out of China. So what else is very interesting is what's going on the cruise ship. So as you know, there's a cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, which is now moored in Yokohama. Everyone's in quarantine. They had about 70 cases. They reported 60 new cases today. The infection was sparked by someone from Hong Kong who left the ship, but he was diagnosed with it. Now, the odd thing is, of these 136 odd new cases, they were randomly tested. So it wasn't as if they presented to the ship's captain and said, gee, I feel awful, I've got a temperature, I'm feeling very bad. This is a result of random tests. A lot of these people, in fact, the vast majority of these people have no symptoms. So it just goes to prove that it can be asymptomatic for a long time or extremely mild, or the long incubation period, because these people haven't yet become sick. I think they tested about 304 new people yesterday, and that produced the between 60 and 66, because there was various reports, new cases. So that's quite a big proportion, sort of 66 odd out of 340. So they haven't tested the whole ship of 3,000, but they're thinking of doing so because there are so many people presenting with the virus, even though they're not showing symptoms. So the Chinese expert, Zhong Nangshen, he said the incubation could actually be as long as 24 days, even though the average is 3 days. And Hubei is reported as being short of testing kits. It was reported that the Bodhi district, which has about 925,000 people near Beijing, they have new laws. Only one person per household can leave the house every 2 days, and there's a curfew between 10 at night and 6 in the morning. So there you go, more evidence of them trialing martial law. In Shanghai, schools are shut until the end of March, so obviously quite worried about it there. Some were reporting that Shenzhou was now in lockdown. That's 500 miles from Wuhan, but there have been no follow-up reports on that, so that may not be slow. But in many cases, news is very slow to come out, because sometimes they're reporting cases and they've been diagnosed sort of early February, and they're only just reporting them. I did hear earlier that IKEA and Apple had closed their stores in China in most of provinces to prevent the spread. And Foxconn, which assembles their iPhones in Shenzhou, and they've got a very large factory in Shenzhou, their workers are not being allowed to return to work for the foreseeable. So in Shenzhou, I think they're also on lockdown. That's the big Chinese city that's closest to Hong Kong. So what we can see from this ship and the sort of figures coming off the ship is huge amounts of people can be carriers. They don't even know they've got it, not presenting with symptoms. But the more you randomly test people, the more it's showing up that they've got it. So it just shows that it could go absolutely anywhere. So the next thing I wanted to do was to discuss this event 201 and just mention a few things. So this event 201, it was to encourage public-private cooperation for pandemic preparedness and response. So they kind of said the next severe pandemic will not always cause great illness and loss of life, but could trigger major cascading economic and social consequences that could contribute to global impact and suffering. Efforts to prevent such consequences or respond to them as they unfold will require unprecedented levels of collaboration between governments, international organizations, and the private sector. There have been important efforts to engage the private sector in epidemic and outbreak preparedness at a national and regional level. So this event 201, it was a pandemic exercise conducted on October the 18th, 2019, and it demonstrated a number of important gaps in pandemic preparedness. So the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, the World Economic Forum, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were jointly involved in proposing various things as a result. Isn't it odd that they're having this whole kind of scenario building exercise in how to deal with a pandemic, and the next thing they've got a real life pandemic where they can play it out? So I wonder if this is now the conspiratorial, because I've been totally factual up till now, but I wonder if this pandemic isn't almost like part of the exercise. It isn't, a live, rolling exercise that we're involved in. So a couple of the things they said was that governments, international organizations, and businesses should plan for how their corporate capabilities will be utilized during a large-scale pandemic. They talked about industry, national governments, and international organizations working together to enhance internationally held stockpiles of medical countermeasures for rapid distribution. They talked about how global transportation companies should work together to maintain travel and trade during these pandemics, because travel and trade are intrinsic to the global economy's success. How governments should provide more resources and support for the development and surge of manufacturing vaccines, therapies, and diagnostics. So obviously it's a huge payday for the pharmaceuticals. And I note in the business news they said one such pharmaceutical company's shares were up by 300% today. So a wonderful payday for them. They said global business should recognize the economic burden of pandemics and fight for better preparedness. International organizations should prioritize reducing the economic impact, blah, blah, blah. This is the interesting part. It said governments and the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis- and disinformation. This is it, clamping down on free speech during these pandemics, so only the official story is out there, or the story they want you to know. So it says governments will need to partner with traditional and social media companies to research and develop nimble approaches to countering misinformation. In other words, shutting down free speech, shutting down reporter journalists, making sure that the only information people get about the virus is from government sources, official sources, media-controlled sources. It said they want the ability to flood media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. In other words, their propaganda. It says public health authorities should work with private employees and trusted community leaders, which of course they'll designate who is a trusted community leader. They said such as faith leaders. Oh, well, of course, I mean, who would ever mistrust a faith leader? And they will promulgate factual information to employees and citizens. Trusted and influential private sector employees should create the capacity to readily and reliably augment public messaging, manage rumors and misinformation, and apply credible information to support emergency public communications. So, again, it says about health authorities working with the WHO to rapidly develop and release consistent health messages. This is all about propaganda and how they want to control the narrative and make sure that people either don't panic or have exactly the right response. What it reminded me of is a very interesting little piece the academic agent did where he analyzed James O'Brien's approach to every caller. And he said what James O'Brien does is he says, an expert from a well-renowned company who's paid a lot of money says X. If you disagree with X, no one should listen to you because you're a nobody. You're not an expert. Bottom line is, listen to authority. Don't question authority. Don't think for yourself. Believe in experts. He said the crux of James O'Brien's approach to every caller is exactly that. And I think that does kind of encapsulate it. I was also looking, actually, a lot of you might have visited the Natural News website and you might enjoy Mike Adams. It's certainly a site I've visited. Some things there are quite interesting. But if you look them up on Wikipedia, it classifies them as a conspiracy website who are promoting unfavorable stories about genetically modified food, vaccines, 5G, climate change, etc. And I say to you, are they saying that the science on genetically modified food, 5G, vaccines, climate change is so settled now that anyone who dares question them or debate them or add new facts to them is a conspiracy theorist? That is actually what they're saying. Only one narrative is allowed, and you can see that's what they're going to do with future pandemics. So I was listening to David Icke's broadcast on the coronavirus, and he mentioned that in American law in the 80s, they took away liability for the pharmaceuticals for vaccines. The reasoning was that a vaccine can never be 100% safe, therefore people shouldn't be allowed to sue vaccine producers like pharmaceutical companies. But what they did do was set up a vaccine court in order to deal with, vaccine claims. And they said that David Icke quoted that this court has so far paid out $4.1 billion in compensation to people and their children damaged by vaccines. And the bar is incredibly high. You don't just pitch up there and say, well, this vaccine did me no good or caused this. The bar is very high. You have to produce experts, pay lawyers. It's obviously very difficult to get a payout. Can you imagine if you time allocated that money? So therefore, you took the amounts that were paid out in the 80s and you factored in the time increase of money, that figure could potentially be a lot larger. So therefore, to tell people they can't question vaccines goes against the evidence that courts are consistently paying out for vaccine damage. Therefore, there is the potential for them to do harm. So how can you possibly just stamp that out? So the next thing I was going to say, just to finish on this and this kind of scenario building. How do you create a crisis? Basically, to create a crisis, all you do is report on it. Think of it this way. You'll wake up on a Monday morning and you'll hear, say you're in London, there's been a stabbing. A man was attacked by a machete. Next day, there are 2 stabbings. This area of London, that area of London. Next day, there are 5 stabbings. And then the following day, there are 2. And for about 14 days, every day you're hearing about a stabbing, and it creates this perception that it's out of control. You'll have MPs on radio stations talking about what we're going to do about it. Every expert calls out the woodwork. The papers are full of it. Overnight, they drop the story, and suddenly it's like stabbings have gone away. You don't hear about them. Obviously they're still happening, but somehow the news agenda has moved on. So to create a crisis, all you have to do is report on it. And I'm wondering if this flu is just a regular flu or cold virus that they needn't have reported it on. But the fact they have chosen to report it has made it a crisis. So what I'd like to see is the figures for the number of people in China who are currently getting normal flu, or what we would call the known about flu and cold, versus the numbers that are getting this flu. And what are the regular numbers of people that got flu? Because only then can we determine if this is actually a real crisis or whether it's just a new type of flu that you generally get every year anyway. Because maybe they are creating a crisis as part of their scenario building so that they can play out their martial law, locking down cities. You can see here in the UK, people being forced into quarantine, and that's what they're talking about on the news today, making it kind of compulsory to go into quarantine. One guy up in the world, he's got cabin fever. He's had enough. He's trying to leave that facility and he's being prevented from doing so. So it just shows, even in the UK here, how they're getting people used to the idea that you can be locked up against your will for an indefinite period if they decide you've got this virus. And obviously cities on lockdown in China, people being dragged, both basically kicking and screaming, to containment centers with bars on the window. They're not necessarily being looked after any better there. They might be better at home. There's no evidence this quarantine is even working. So you can see how this has enabled them to play out the scenario and to get it into our heads that we could actually, even in the UK, be locked up in quarantine, be stopped from going to work, blah, blah, blah. Now, the other interesting thing is how coronavirus has brought China's surveillance state out of the shadows. This was reported on Reuters. You can look it up using that title. Reuters, Beijing, Hong Kong. So there was a man from Hangzhou, and he returned from a business trip, and the local police got in touch with him. They had tracked his car by his license plate in nearby Wenzhou, which had a spate of coronavirus cases, despite being far from the epicenter of the outbreak. Stay indoors for 2 weeks, that's what they told him. So did he? Well, after around 12 days, he was totally bored, so he went out early. This time, not only did the police contact him, but so did his boss. He'd been spotted near Hangzhou's West Lake by a camera with facial recognition technology, and the authorities had alerted his company as a warning. I was a bit shocked by the ability and efficiency of the mass surveillance network. They can basically trace our movements with the AI technology and big data at any time and any place, said the man, who'd asked not to be identified for fear of repercussions. The Chinese have long been aware that they are tracked by the world's most sophisticated system of electronic surveillance, and this emergency has brought some of that technology out of the shadows, proving the authorities, have this power and providing them with a justification for sweeping methods of high-tech social control. So AI and security camera companies boast that their systems can scan the streets for people even with low-grade fevers. They can recognize their faces even if they're wearing masks, and they can report them to the authorities. I mean, just think about that for a second. So if a corona patient boards a train, the railway system can provide a list of people sitting nearby. Mobile phone apps can tell users if they've been on a flight or a train with a known carrier, and maps can show them locations of buildings where infected patients live. So although, there've been some anonymous grumbling on social media, for now, the Chinese are just accepting this extra intrusion, even embracing it because they want to stop a health emergency. Typical problem, reaction, solution. If there wasn't this problem, they'd be far less likely to accept it, but when presented with what appears to be, or is hyped up as being a mass crisis, people do accept these things. And they might even consider it reasonable, even if they're not specifically informed about it. You see, people will sacrifice civil liberties if they believe there's a problem. That's why it's important for them to create crises with terrorism, with viruses, so people are willing to sacrifice civil liberties. So telecoms companies have long been tracking the movements of their users. China Mobile Phone promoted this as a service, sending text messages to Beijing residents telling them that they can check where they've been over the past 30 days. It didn't really explain why they might want to use the service, but I guess it would be useful if you were questioned by the authorities or your employees about your travel. So in the era of big data and internet, the flow of each person is clearly seen. So we're very different now from the SARS time, that said epidemiologist Li Luangjian in an interview. With such new technologies, we should make full use of them to find the source of infection and contain the source of infection. Yeah, that's why they need infection. Otherwise, people would ask too many questions about it. But just look what's coming down the pipeline. It is terrifying. So the industry minister sent a note to China's AI companies and research institutes this week, calling on them to help fight the outbreak. So facial recognition firm Megvii said on Tuesday it had developed a new way to spot and identify people with fevers, with support from the industry and science ministries. They said our new AI temperature measurement system, which detects temperature with a thermal camera and uses body and facial data to identify individuals, is already being tested in Beijing. Oh my God. SenseTime, which is another leading AI firm, says it's built a similar system to be used at building entrances, which will identify people wearing masks, overcoming a weakness of earlier technology, which of course was put off by masks, but now it's not, and they can also detect fevers. So the Chinese Academy of Railway Scientists explained how this technology can also help authorities find people who might have been exposed to a confined or suspected coronavirus on a train. So they retrieve relevant information about the passenger, including train number, carriage number, and information on passengers who were close to the person, even people sitting three or four rows away from the person, and they extract that information and provide it to the relevant departments. So there you go. I'm actually speechless and breathless after reading that. Just proves to you guys the scope, the power of control available through AI, and it's going to be even more so with 5G. Every movement is going to be tracked, and we won't be able to be invisible at all. And health services can also, of course, if they think our temperature's high, gives them the license to drag us off the street and take us to basically a quarantine prison. So there's no need to lock people up. All they do is assert that you've got a temperature, and it gives them the right to quarantine you, hashtag imprison you, or disappear you. So I think I'll leave it there. Scary stuff, huh?